our line of absolutely terrific speakers. We have Joel Zika here from Australia talking about dark rides and the evolution of immersive media.
This is a small fraction of probably 10 years of research. Today I want to focus on what a dark ride actually is and setting a definition for the format, and then looking at whether we can ascertain from that definition whether there is a legacy that the dark ride plays in immersive media. So very quickly, I'll take you back to an important historical point in the evolution of this format called the dark ride. The Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901. And at that park, we've got a lot of the use of electricity and a lot of different attractions being launched and a new wave of entertainment. Particularly is an attraction called A Trip to the Moon. So this is 1901, and this is a multimedia exhibit whereupon people board a animatronic pneumatic ship in the middle of a room, an indoor space, and it moves around, and it gives the illusion through cycloramas and panoramas that you're being transported to the moon. It was a forerunner to the film Le Voyage dans la Lune by about 9 months and followed a very similar trajectory. So in the 1980s, a new way of looking at cinema studies evolved, which was defined as early cinema, and it established the precedent that all of these types of early media devices could and should be looked at in analysing and discussing the makeup of contemporary cinema. So everything from the cyclorama to projections, phantom rides, all these things that we know quite well, or you will know if you're interested in media history. The problem with this theory for someone interested in dark rides is that it doesn't think about the period from 1901 until the 1980s, when the studies by theorists like Tom Gunning, who are very well known, established it. So there seems to be a large gap in terms of how media throughout the 20th century came together to influence not just cinema today, but other media formats. So there's a sort of a pipeline where everything from the 1800s and the early 20th century is at one end and contemporary cinema is at the other. Or at least that's my interpretation. So in discussions of A Trip to the Moon, the ride in 1901, it's regularly discussed as a dark ride. But in all early cinema studies, there are no other mentions of any other dark rides. And most of you can think of ones, and it wouldn't surprise you to know that there are a lot that still exist that represent the decades, not just from the 30s, but from the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, all the way up to the 80s, when digital media starts to play a greater role. So my study centers around the idea that I've gone to each of the remaining dark ride attractions that existed from the 30s to the 80s. So I've called that the PreDigital Era. And here's a quick map of where they exist in the United States. There are two outside of the United States that I've looked at. There's a few grey area rides that we can discuss over a beer later. But one very important artefact in Melbourne, Australia, where I'm from, and one in Blackpool in the UK. I wanted to define the format and then have a look at what evidence there is for its influence on new media technology today. So how do you do that? Do I just go off and ride these rides and sort of make notes in the dark? Technology was at such a point when I started this documentative part of the project 3 years ago, where new cameras are on the market that would allow me to capture in very low light conditions. And so I built a custom virtual reality film rig to capture in all directions, 360 degrees. And used a bunch of sort of ad hoc products to attach this rig of cameras to rides. And thanks to the help of Luna Park in Melbourne, I was able to test the rig out a few times. This is not the final idea, but you get the picture. Now, I don't know what I'm looking for necessarily. I mean, from an academic standpoint, I have some ideas about what all dark rides are and how to classify them all, but all I know is that from my early testing, and this was a 180-degree camera setup which captured everything in front of me on the ride. I set that up and I went down to Luna Park and they gave me a day to work and operate on the ride when it wasn't being used, which is an incredibly great asset to have. And what I noticed, my partner went in the ride with me and she had a Samsung mobile phone. So I've spent $10,000 on cameras and she goes in with her phone and says, I love that piano in the first moment of the Luna Park ghost train. And I said, all right, I'll just go over the footage. No, there's no piano. And so I hadn't actually been riding the ride. I'd been sending the cameras through the ride to capture it. And what I realized is, first, this is 3 years ago, is that many of the components of a dark ride are way outside of your peripheral vision and attract you to move your head and to think in a 360-degree way. My original rig was simply just to capture a nice panoramic image, but immediately I realized that I had to create a virtual reality rig that captured in absolutely every direction, because I was going to travel the world and I've got no idea. There's no documentary footage of dark rides, especially not ones built in the 50s and the 30s. So I need to be prepared to capture in every single direction. So I built a new rig and it allowed me to capture in this sort of total panorama. Okay, so the method was to document and analyze the remaining examples of the pre-digital dark ride format, which I had learned about and sort of plotted a little map. It was to observe the common technical principles or techniques that are consistent throughout the study, or throughout those examples, and then to compare those observations to leading works of immersive media that exist today. So a little bit of history that helps me identify and tell you a little bit about the construction of these rides and tell a bit of the story about the journey to explore their history. In the 1930s, Leon Cassidy and Marvin Rempfer wanted to design and patent, most importantly, a method for building ride attractions indoors, in the dark. They wanted to sell that patent, that model, and they did so in the form of the 1929 patent for the indoor amusement railway. So this is a big deal, because in 1929, at the turn of the century, there have been explorations of the format, right? Dark indoor attractions, but it's impossible to study those sort of ad hoc amusements. There's no documentation. But here we have a model, an actual plan for how a dark ride is going to work. And it's very telling for anybody who's worked in game design or level design, or obviously ride design, because it includes key factors, trigger points, where certain attractions will go off and on. And it's important to understand that Cassidy and Rempfer sold 1,700 of these rides across the United States. So this was a mass and distributed format. The actual way that it was sort of laid out and developed in individual sites is a study that is yet to happen. So how people actually took these packages and applied them. People would write to the company and say, I have a space that is XYZ big, and they would design them a track and send it out. So you have essentially a dev pack, if you're of the IT kind of mode, a set of components that you can work with. Very similar to how you might work with Unity and a mobile phone today. You've got an engine to render, you've got a mode, and you've got parameters by which you can move within that. There is lots to talk about the way you interact with the imagery that I was aware of from documentation and from photographs and anecdotal stuff, but really I needed to get onto the study. So we can go on and on about that, but a lot of my preconceptions were sort of were broken. And even that first interaction with Luna Park's dark ride, which was built in 1936, which makes it the second oldest example of the format, and it was a delivered product from the Pretzel Company to Melbourne, Australia, which I can't fathom. There's the piano, which is almost at 190 degrees off the centre. The Ghost Train in Blackpool, it was built in 1934, the oldest running cart-based dark ride on the planet. And Blackpool and Luna Park in Australia have a different attitude towards restoring and maintaining the heritage of this format, which meant that these rides still exist from the 1930s. In the USA, the earliest examples of the Pretzel Company rides are the Laughland in Sylvan Beach in upstate New York, where you've all gone, I'm sure. Obviously, everybody has been there. It's a very popular place. It has got one of the most beautiful, iconic 1950s facades you've ever seen. It has an absolutely untouched dark ride operated by a man who lives in the back of it. The Spookorama in New York was built the year before it, and so both of them exhibit very different applications of the pretzel design. The Spookorama is an incredibly interesting design because it has no walls. There is no architectural structure in the Spookorama environment. What happens when you enter it is these rotating, high-arched deco carts twist and move you and edit the experience as you go through the ride so as to create a sequence of narrative. But it's done purely with movement. And it's one of the key spaces where you can see that it's all about the design of the cart and your placement in space, and not about traditional architectural ideas. This guy's name is Bill Tracy. He built 57 rides in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and his approach was far more psychedelic. This is the Haunted Mansion at Knoebels. This is a park that has documented and held onto parts of rides, and their Haunted Mansion is effectively a museum to dark rides past. What Dick did was he bought up old dark rides as they went out of business and has created an homage to the format. Okay, so what was learnt? There are 6 key characteristics that are exhibited in every single pre-digital dark ride. They are that there is a journey. You could call this thematics. Something is that you're going to travel to somewhere and you're made aware of that through either the facade, the waiting room, even the cart itself. Right? You don't go in blindly and discover what you're doing from the media itself. Something is built into the experience that creates that journey. There is full control of lighting. That sounds like a simple idea, but at every part of a dark ride, there's the ability for you to be in complete darkness. So from 1901 and from the advent of electricity, it's an obvious thing, but what we're actually able to do is to control every part of the experience. So neon colours and lights and things like that. And that's also why we're able to create optical illusion. So all the way back to the 1930s, we see the use of perspectival illusion through two-dimensional imaging. Haptic feedback, even at its simplest level, you'll be traveling through a rocky tunnel, and instead of just moving flat, the cart will be augmented in some way to rock you along with the visuals that you see around you. String hanging from the roof. Simple things like that in all of these examples of the dark ride. Triggered sound and 360-degree scenes at every juncture. Audio could be something as simple as a siren, a horn, or in the case of Sylvan Beach, it's a bucket of pieces of metal that as the cart rolls by, it falls down, and then as you go past, I think it springs back up. Let's look at just a couple of contemporary examples, and you'll know these experiences, at least one of them, really well, and we can see exemplified those 6 characteristics that lead to their immersive qualities. Now, we're not talking about necessarily what the narrative quality is. This is just a quantitative sort of analysis. Harry Potter and the Forbidden Journey uses all of these techniques, and it uses them exceptionally well, but it uses them in that tradition, right? Projection designed to create optical illusion, 360-degree environments, you break in and out of experiences, to complete darkness so that you can hide different elements of the ride, sound and score, even though they're through advanced technology, are still exactly the same and applied in the same way. In terms of a virtual reality immersive experience, one of the most awarded ones of the last couple of years is Ghostbusters Dimension. And here we see a physical structure that's been built that VR actually creates a completely darkened experience, right? But we use wind and haptics throughout that sort of progression. You have one of the key elements to it is a themed entryway, so you're in the character. Just to quickly, the third example is Jurassic World: The Fallen Kingdom, a 4D cinema experience where these ideas of immersion aren't applied as well. The experience isn't as effective. There isn't as much thematics. There is an attempt to use haptics all the way through the experience, and it's in the service of a film. It doesn't work quite as well. These outcomes are important because all through the IAAPA, we've heard people talk about the way we can apply technology to the theme park experience. And this research establishes that the theme park has always set the parameters and the mission statement for the use of technology in immersive experiences. So where we think about VR being applied to something, I would argue that theme parks have always held true to these ideals, and the best examples for building immersive experiences come from the theme park and from its history of development. We have a massive problem that we've lost thousands of these dark ride experiences. There's no books, no archives. There's absolutely no documentation of this crucial experience which is part of the horror vernacular. It is part of virtual reality. And this research hopefully is the first step to getting it kind of on the map of American media entertainment. Thank you.